In the final years of World War II, thousands of German soldiers carried a fear far greater than bullets or bombs. It was the fear of being captured by the Americans. For years they had been told a terrifying story. According to the propaganda they grew up with, American soldiers were not just enemies on the battlefield. They were brutal men who humiliated prisoners, starved them, and punished them without mercy. German soldiers were warned that surrendering to the United States Army would lead to suffering that many would not survive. This belief ran so deep that some German units fought to the last bullet simply to avoid capture. Others whispered to each other that death on the battlefield was a better fate than falling into American hands. They had seen the posters, they had heard the speeches. Officers repeated the warnings again and again. If you are captured by the Americans, you will regret it for the rest of your life. But war has a way of breaking certainty. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, entire German divisions collapsed under the pressure. Cities fell, supply lines shattered, and soldiers who had once marched confidently across the continent now faced a harsh reality. Many had no choice but to surrender. When the moment finally came, most of them expected cruelty. They expected shouting guards, beatings, and humiliation. Some even believed they would be executed the moment they laid down their weapons. That was the image they carried in their minds as they raised their hands and walked toward the American soldiers waiting for them. But something strange happened. Instead of violence, they were searched quickly and given water. Instead of insults, they were ordered calmly to move into groups. The guards watched them closely, but there was no rage in their faces, just discipline. For many prisoners, this was only the beginning of a much larger confusion, because the real shock had not yet arrived. Soon, they would be placed on ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. They believed they were being sent to the most brutal prison camps imaginable. Rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Some said the Americans were taking them away, so nobody would ever hear from them again. Others believed they would be forced into brutal labor camps somewhere deep in the United States. The truth was something none of them could have imagined. And when they finally stepped onto American soil, the first thing they saw would begin to unravel everything they thought they knew about their enemy. Long before any German soldier ever saw an American battlefield, a different war had already begun inside their minds. It was a war of stories, images, and carefully crafted lies designed to shape how they saw the world. From the moment many of them entered military training, they were surrounded by propaganda that described the United States in the darkest possible terms. Posters, newspapers, speeches, and films repeated the same message again and again. America was portrayed as a nation without honor, a country full of weak people led by cruel soldiers who showed no respect for their enemies. German soldiers were warned that Americans had no discipline, no moral code, and no mercy for prisoners of war. According to the stories they heard, surrendering to American forces would not lead to captivity. It would lead to humiliation and suffering. Officers reinforced these ideas constantly. Before deployments, commanders would gather their soldiers and repeat the warnings they had heard from higher authorities. They told them that the Americans would beat prisoners, starve them, and use them as tools for propaganda. Some soldiers were even told that Americans enjoyed humiliating captured enemies simply to prove their dominance. The goal of this propaganda was simple. It was meant to make surrender unthinkable. If soldiers believed that capture meant torture or death, they would fight harder and longer on the battlefield. Fear could be a powerful weapon, and the Nazi leadership used that fear to keep their army loyal, even as the war slowly turned against them. Over time, these stories became something deeper than propaganda. They became truth in the minds of many German soldiers. Young recruits who had never met an American believed these stories completely. Even experienced soldiers who had spent years in combat repeated them to each other around campfires and in quiet conversations during long marches. The idea spread like an invisible rule among them: never surrender to the Americans. Some soldiers made quiet promises to their friends. If capture ever seemed unavoidable, they would destroy their weapons and try to escape. If escape was impossible, they would fight until their ammunition was gone. And if all hope was lost, they would choose death over the shame and suffering they believed awaited them in an American prison camp. For years, this belief shaped their decisions on the battlefield. But propaganda has one weakness: it can survive only as long as people never see the truth for themselves. And soon, thousands of German soldiers would come face to face with the very enemy they had been taught to fear. For many German soldiers, the moment of surrender did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, day after day, as the war turned against them. By late 1944, the front lines were collapsing across Europe. Cities were falling. Supply lines were breaking. Entire units were running out of ammunition, fuel and food. What had once looked like an unstoppable war machine now felt like a crumbling wall. Soldiers who had marched across Europe only a few years earlier now found themselves retreating through destroyed towns and frozen countryside. The sound of artillery followed them constantly. Allied aircraft controlled the skies above them. Every road, every bridge, every open field felt dangerous. And somewhere beyond those lines, the American army was coming closer. Many German soldiers had never seen an American soldier before. They had only heard the stories repeated so many times that they had become almost impossible to question. The Americans were supposed to be ruthless. They were supposed to enjoy humiliating their enemies. So when the moment of surrender finally arrived, fear spread quickly among the exhausted troops. Sometimes it happened during a battle that could no longer be won. Sometimes it happened quietly, when a group of soldiers realized they had been surrounded. White cloths appeared on rifle barrels, hands slowly rose into the air. And in those moments, the soldiers waiting to surrender felt something heavier than defeat. They felt dread. Many expected shouting. Some expected beatings the moment they dropped their weapons. A few believed they might be executed simply as revenge for the years of brutal fighting that had devastated Europe. Some soldiers even whispered quick prayers before walking forward. But the first encounters with American soldiers did not unfold the way they imagined. Instead of chaos, there was order. American soldiers searched them quickly, collecting weapons and checking for hidden knives or pistols. The prisoners were counted, grouped together and watched carefully. The guards were alert, serious and disciplined. Yet something was missing. There was no rage, no shouting, no punishment. For many of the captured Germans, this was confusing enough. They had expected hatred, but what they saw instead was something far stranger: professionalism. The American soldiers did not celebrate their capture. They did not insult them. They simply treated the moment as another task in a long and exhausting war. Some prisoners glanced at each other quietly, unsure what to think. Perhaps the cruelty would come later. Perhaps this calm was only temporary. What none of them realized in that moment was that the real shock of their captivity had not even begun, because soon they would be placed onto ships and transported thousands of miles away, to a country most of them had only seen in propaganda posters, a country they believed was the most dangerous place they could possibly end up. After the surrender, the German prisoners were moved quickly away from the front lines. Trucks carried them through roads crowded with soldiers, vehicles, and the endless movement of a war that was still raging across Europe. For many of them, this was the first moment they truly felt the war was over for them. They were no longer fighters, they were prisoners, but no one told them where they were going. Rumors began almost immediately. Some said they would be taken to camps somewhere in France. Others believed they would be sent to England. But after several days of transport and waiting, a strange realization began to spread among the prisoners. They were being taken to ships. Massive transport ships stood waiting in the harbors, surrounded by American guards and naval crews. The prisoners were counted, searched again, and then guided up long metal ramps into the holds of the vessels. Inside, rows of bunks had been prepared for them. The air smelled of metal, oil, and salt from the ocean outside. Still, no one explained the destination. As the ships finally left the European coast, the prisoners gathered quietly in small groups, trying to understand what was happening. Some believed they were being transported to remote prison camps where they would be forgotten by the world. Others feared something darker. A few whispered that the Americans might be taking them far away, simply so no one would ever hear what happened to them. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly around them. Days passed as the ships pushed westward through cold water and heavy winds.
There you go.
The prisoners
Who's
spent
next?
their time
Much
waiting,
obliged.
talking, and thinking.
take some.
With every mile that passed, the uncertainty
We'll
grew
see home
heavier.
again.
But something else
Stick
was
together,
happening
mate.
on those ships that many of them did not expect. They were being fed. Every day, meals were brought down to the prisoners. Bread, soup, sometimes meat. It was not luxury, but it was steady, enough to keep them healthy during the long journey. Some prisoners looked at the food with suspicion. A few refused to eat at first, convinced it might be part of some strange psychological strategy. Others tasted it carefully, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nothing did. Days turned into weeks as the ships crossed the ocean. And then one morning, after endless water and sky, the ships slowed down. Through the fog and the early sunlight, a coastline began to appear on the horizon. Tall buildings, wide harbors, and a land that most of the prisoners had only heard about through propaganda stories, the United States of America. For many of them, fear returned stronger than ever, because they believed they had just arrived at the place where their suffering would finally begin. What they did not know was that the moment they stepped onto that land, everything they believed about America was about to be tested. When the ships finally slowed and the prisoners were ordered onto the decks, many of them stood silently, staring at the land that had slowly appeared on the horizon. This was the country they had heard about for years,
Much obliged.
the country described
I'll
in
take some.
propaganda as ruthless, arrogant,
See home again.
and dangerous.
We stick together, mate.
The place where they believed their suffering would begin. But the first thing they noticed was something unexpected: calm. The harbor was busy but not chaotic. Large cargo ships moved slowly through the water. Dock workers loaded crates and equipment while trucks waited patiently nearby. There were soldiers, yes, but there were also civilians walking through the streets beyond the port, men in work clothes, women carrying bags, children running along sidewalks. For a moment, the prisoners simply watched. It did not look like the terrifying image they had been shown for years. There were no screaming crowds, no angry mobs waiting for captured enemies, no signs of revenge or hatred. Life seemed to be moving normally all around them. When the prisoners were finally ordered off the ships, they stepped carefully onto the docks. American soldiers stood nearby with rifles, watching closely but saying very little. The process was organized and controlled. Names were recorded, groups were counted again. Still, there was no cruelty. Many prisoners had expected insults or humiliation the moment they set foot on American soil. Some had even prepared themselves for violence. Instead, the guards spoke in calm voices, giving simple instructions. Move forward, stay in line, follow the truck. That was all. As the prisoners were loaded onto trucks and transported away from the harbor, something even stranger began to appear before their eyes. Cities. Large buildings rose above clean streets. Cars moved through intersections. Stores displayed goods in their windows. People walked freely through parks and neighborhoods that looked untouched by the destruction of war. For German soldiers who had spent years moving through bombed cities and ruined villages in Europe, the sight was almost unreal. Some prisoners stared silently at the streets passing by. Others whispered quietly to each other. How could this be the same country they had been warned about? How could a nation supposedly filled with cruelty look so ordinary? But many of them still believed this was only the surface. They told themselves the real truth would appear once they reached the prison camps, because surely the Americans would reveal their true nature there. What they were about to discover inside those camps would challenge everything they thought they knew. After hours of driving away from the harbor, the trucks finally slowed down on a long road surrounded by open land. Some prisoners expected to see high walls, watchtowers filled with armed guards, and harsh compounds designed to break the spirits of anyone inside them. Instead, the first thing they noticed was something simple: wooden buildings. Rows of long barracks stood quietly behind barbed wire fences. There were guard towers, but they were not crowded with nervous soldiers. The camp looked organized, almost calm. Paths ran between the buildings. Small groups of prisoners could be seen moving between structures under the watch of guards. The truck stopped, and the prisoners were ordered to step down one by one. For a moment, many of them simply stood there, observing their surroundings carefully. They were waiting for the moment when the true nature of the camp would reveal itself. Perhaps the shouting would begin. Perhaps the beatings would start. But nothing happened. American guards directed them calmly toward a registration area where their names were recorded again. They were searched once more for weapons or hidden items, then guided toward the barracks where they would sleep. Inside the buildings, rows of bunk beds filled the rooms, simple wooden frames with mattresses and blankets neatly arranged. The floors were clean. Windows allowed sunlight to enter the room. Some prisoners walked slowly through the barracks, touching the beds with disbelief. This was not what they had expected. They had imagined cold concrete cells, dark rooms, and overcrowded spaces where survival would depend on strength alone. Instead, they were looking at something closer to ordinary military housing. Still, many of them refused to believe it. They whispered quietly among themselves that the Americans were playing a game. Perhaps this comfortable environment was only temporary. Maybe the real punishment would begin later, once the prisoners had lowered their guard. Others suspected something even more complicated. They believed the Americans might be trying to break them psychologically, treat them well at first, gain their trust, and then use that trust against them. So they waited. They watched the guards. They watched the routines of the camp, and they prepared themselves for the moment when the truth would finally appear. But the next surprise arrived sooner than they expected, because soon they would be called together for their first meal in the American prison camp. And that moment would create even more confusion than the camp itself. Not long after the prisoners were shown their barracks, a guard walked through the camp, calling them to assemble outside. The order was simple and clear. It was time for their first meal. For many of the German prisoners, this moment created a strange kind of tension. Food meant survival, but it also meant uncertainty. They had heard countless stories about what happened to prisoners captured by their enemies. Some believed they would be given barely enough food to stay alive. Others had been warned that American camps used food as a form of punishment. A few even feared something far worse: poison. As the prisoners were guided toward the mess hall, quiet conversations began spreading through the group. Some soldiers advised caution. Others said it was better to wait and see what happened to the first men who tried the food. Inside the building, long tables were arranged in neat rows. Trays were placed in front of each seat. Large containers of soup, bread, and other simple foods were brought out by American personnel who worked quickly and efficiently. The smell alone caused some prisoners to pause. It smelled like real food: hot soup, fresh bread, portions that looked larger than what many of them had eaten during the final months of the war in Europe. But that only increased the suspicion. Several prisoners stared at the trays in front of them without touching anything. A few leaned closer, examining the food carefully, as if trying to find signs of something dangerous. They whispered quietly to the men sitting beside them. Maybe this is a test. Maybe they want to see who eats first. One man finally picked up his spoon. The room seemed to grow quieter as others watched him. Slowly he tasted the soup. Nothing happened. He took another spoonful. Still nothing. A few more prisoners began to eat cautiously, watching each other between bites. Within minutes, the room that had once been filled with hesitation slowly turned into something different, relief. The food was real, warm, filling. For soldiers who had spent months eating scarce rations and sometimes going hungry on collapsing battlefronts, the meal felt almost unbelievable. Some prisoners finished their trays quickly and looked around in disbelief at what had just happened.
There you go. Who's next?
This was not the treatment they had been warned about. Still, many of them refused to accept the idea that this was normal. They convinced themselves that the Americans were simply trying to gain their trust. Soon enough, they thought, the real cruelty would begin. But the next surprise would not come from the food or the buildings inside the camp. It would come from the men guarding them, because the American guards behaved in ways that none of the prisoners could explain. After the first days inside the camp, the prisoners began paying closer attention to the men responsible for guarding them. These were the soldiers they had feared the most. According to everything they had been told, American guards were supposed to be arrogant, cruel, and eager to humiliate captured enemies. But what the prisoners saw each day made less and less sense. The guards were strict. They watched the camp carefully and made sure that every rule was followed. They carried rifles and stood in the towers surrounding the fences. No one doubted that they were in control, yet their behavior was strangely calm. They did not scream at the prisoners. They did not strike them. They gave orders in short, clear instructions and expected those instructions to be followed. When prisoners lined up for meals or work assignments, the guards watched closely but rarely spoke more than necessary. For many prisoners, this created a strange feeling of confusion. One afternoon, a small group of prisoners was being escorted across the camp when one of the guards noticed a man limping badly. Instead of yelling at him to move faster, the guard stopped the group and signaled for a medic. Within minutes, the injured prisoner was taken to a medical building inside the camp. The other prisoners watched silently. Moments like that began to appear more often. A guard handing a prisoner a blanket during a cold night, another explaining the camp rules patiently instead of shouting them, a soldier correcting a misunderstanding instead of punishing it. These were small actions, but they carried enormous weight for men who had been taught to expect cruelty. At first, many prisoners believed this behavior was only temporary. They assumed the guards were trying to create a false sense of security. Perhaps later the Americans would reveal their true intentions. But as the days passed, the same pattern continued. The guards remained professional. They enforced discipline, but they did not humiliate the prisoners. And slowly, something began to change inside the camp. The prisoners started watching the guards in a different way, not with fear, but with curiosity, because the more they observed these men, the harder it became to believe the stories they had been told. Still, the prisoners had not yet discovered the most shocking truth about their situation. Soon, they would learn that their treatment inside the camp was not simply kindness or luck.
Who's next?
It was something far more surprising. It was the law. A few days after settling into the camp, the prisoners were gathered together for an announcement. Most of them expected a list of rules, punishments, and strict warnings about what would happen if they disobeyed the guards. That was how prison camps were supposed to work. But what they heard instead left many of them staring at each other in disbelief. An American officer stood in front of the group and began explaining the regulations of the camp. He spoke calmly, while a translator repeated every word in German so that no one could misunderstand. The officer explained that the camp followed international rules established by the Geneva Convention. These rules defined how prisoners of war had to be treated. According to those rules, the prisoners were entitled to food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. At first, many prisoners thought they had misunderstood. Protection. That word did not belong in a prison camp. But the officer continued. Prisoners would receive regular meals. They would have access to medical treatment if they were injured or sick. They would be allowed to send and receive letters. If they worked inside or outside the camp, they would receive small payments for their labor. The translator repeated each statement clearly. Some prisoners exchanged confused looks. Others shook their heads quietly, convinced that this must be some kind of deception. One soldier whispered to the man beside him that it sounded like a performance. Perhaps the Americans wanted them to believe these promises for a while before revealing their true intentions. But the days that followed only deepened the confusion. Medical checkups were conducted regularly. Prisoners who reported illness were taken seriously and treated by doctors. Clothing and blankets were distributed when needed. Work assignments were organized in ways that matched the physical condition of the prisoners, and slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The prisoners realized that these promises were not empty words. The rules were being followed. For soldiers who had been taught that their enemies would treat them with cruelty, this realization was difficult to accept. It did not fit with anything they had been told. Yet every day inside the camp offered another piece of evidence. The Americans were not breaking them. They were following rules that respected them as human beings. Still, the prisoners had not yet experienced the moment that would challenge their beliefs the most, because soon many of them would leave the camp for the first time and see how ordinary Americans lived their daily lives. And that experience would change the way they understood the country they had once feared. Not long after the prisoners had settled into the routines of the camp, a new announcement spread quietly through the barracks. Some of the prisoners would be assigned to work outside the camp. At first, the idea made many of them uneasy. They did not know what kind of work they would be forced to do. Some imagined brutal labor in dangerous conditions. Others feared it might be a trap designed to test their obedience or punish them if they failed. But when the first groups were selected and transported away from the camp, what they discovered was something completely unexpected. They were being sent to American farms. During the war, many American farmers were struggling. Large numbers of young men had joined the military and left their farms behind. Crops still needed to be planted, harvested, and transported, but there were fewer hands available to do the work. The solution had been surprisingly simple. Prisoners of war would help. The first German prisoners who arrived at these farms were cautious. They stepped down from the trucks and looked around carefully, trying to understand the situation. Instead of prison fences and guards shouting orders, they saw fields stretching across the countryside. Barns stood beside quiet dirt roads. Farmhouses rested under wide skies. And waiting near those fields were American families. Farmers approached the prisoners with curious expressions, not with anger. They spoke through translators or simple gestures, explaining the work that needed to be done. Harvest crops, repair fences, carry supplies. The guards remained nearby, watching carefully. But the atmosphere was very different from what the prisoners had imagined. For the first time since their capture, many German soldiers found themselves working side by side with ordinary Americans. They noticed small details that made a lasting impression. The farmers shared water during long hours in the sun. Sometimes they offered extra food at midday. They spoke calmly, treating the prisoners as workers rather than enemies. For the prisoners, these moments created a quiet conflict in their minds. They had been taught that Americans hated them, that the civilians would see them as monsters responsible for the war. Yet here they were, working in fields with people who simply seemed focused on finishing the day's work. One prisoner later remembered the moment he realized something strange was happening. An American farmer thanked him. Just a simple word, spoken with a nod after a long day of labor. That small gesture stayed with him long after the work ended, because it did not fit the story he had believed for so many years. And as more prisoners returned to the camp each evening with similar stories, conversations inside the barracks began to change. The doubts that had once been whispered quietly were now growing louder. Maybe the world outside Germany was not what they had been told. As the months passed, the routine inside the camps became strangely familiar to many of the prisoners. Days followed a predictable rhythm. Wake up, eat breakfast, work assignments, return to the barracks, evening meals, conversations before sleep. For men who had spent years living under constant danger on the front lines, this routine felt almost peaceful. And slowly, a strange realization began to spread through the camp. Life here was stable. There were no artillery explosions shaking the ground in the middle of the night. No sudden orders to march into battle. No shortages of food or water. The prisoners had beds, regular meals, and medical care whenever someone became sick or injured. Many of them had not experienced that kind of stability in years. Some of the men who worked on nearby farms returned each evening with stories that sounded even more unbelievable. They described wide open fields, quiet towns, and American families living ordinary lives far from the destruction that had consumed Europe. They spoke about full grocery stores, clean streets, children playing in neighborhoods that had never seen a bomb fall from the sky. For prisoners who had left behind cities reduced to rubble and families struggling to survive in a collapsing Germany, these stories created a powerful contrast. At first, the men spoke about these experiences with hesitation. They were careful about what they said and who might hear them. Many still feared that showing admiration for their enemy could be seen as betrayal. But as more prisoners shared similar experiences, the conversations became more open. Some admitted that they had never imagined America would look like this. Others said something even more surprising. They were worried about going home. Letters arriving from Germany painted a grim picture. Entire neighborhoods destroyed by bombing raids. Food shortages growing worse each month. Families struggling to survive in cities that barely functioned anymore. Compared to that reality, life inside the American prison camps began to feel strangely secure. A few prisoners even joked quietly among themselves about the idea of staying longer, not because they wanted to remain prisoners forever, but because the outside world they would return to seemed far more uncertain. For men who had been raised to believe that America was their most dangerous enemy, this was a deeply confusing feeling. The country they had feared the most had become the place where they felt the safest. And as that realization slowly settled into their minds, another conversation began spreading through the camp. A conversation about the truth. Because if America was not the cruel enemy they had been warned about, then something else must have been a lie. Inside the barracks, long after the lights dimmed and the guards finished their rounds, the real transformation began. At night, the camp grew quiet, but the conversations continued in low voices between men lying awake in their bunks. These were the moments when the prisoners began speaking honestly with each other about something they had avoided since arriving in America: their doubts. At first, the discussions were cautious. No one wanted to sound disloyal to their country. Many of them had grown up in a system where questioning official stories could be dangerous. Even here, thousands of miles from Germany, that habit of silence was hard to break. But the experiences they were living through every day made silence impossible. One soldier would describe the farm where he worked and the American family who had treated him fairly. Another would talk about the doctor who had treated his injured leg without asking questions about which side he had fought for. Someone else would mention the food they were given every day, food that was often better than what they had eaten during the final months of the war. The stories sounded almost unbelievable when placed beside the warnings they had heard for years. According to the propaganda they had grown up with, Americans were supposed to be cruel and arrogant. They were supposed to humiliate their enemies and treat prisoners as less than human. But nothing inside the camp matched those stories. One night, a former sergeant spoke quietly from the corner of the room. He had spent more time on the front lines than most of the others, and the younger soldiers often listened when he spoke. He said something simple. If the Americans were the monsters we were told about, why are they treating us like this? The question hung in the air. No one answered immediately, because deep down, many of them were starting to realize the same thing. The problem was not what they were seeing in America. The problem was what they had been told before the war. For the first time, some prisoners began questioning the information they had trusted their entire lives. They remembered the speeches, the posters, the confident promises made by leaders who had insisted that Germany understood the world better than anyone else. Now those memories felt different, because every day inside the camp offered quiet proof that those promises had not been entirely true. And as those doubts continued to grow, another shock was on its way. Soon the prisoners would begin receiving letters from home, letters that would reveal just how different life in Germany had become. The first letters began arriving quietly. At first there were only a few. A guard would enter the barracks holding a small stack of envelopes and begin calling names. Prisoners would step forward, take the letters carefully, and return to their bunks with a mixture of hope and fear. For many of them, it had been months since they had heard anything from home. Some unfolded the paper immediately, eager to read every word. Others waited, staring at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, as if preparing themselves for whatever news might be inside. The silence in the barracks often grew heavy during those moments, because the letters did not describe the Germany the soldiers remembered. They described a country struggling to survive. Cities that had once been filled with life were now covered in ruins after endless bombing raids. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared under clouds of smoke and fire. Families were living in damaged buildings, basements, and temporary shelters. Food had become scarce. Many letters spoke about long lines outside ration stations. Bread, potatoes, and whatever small portions could be found were carefully divided among families trying to endure another winter. Mothers wrote about children going to bed hungry. Fathers described working long hours just to secure enough food for the next day. Some letters carried even heavier news: friends who had died, homes that no longer existed, entire streets that had vanished under the destruction of war. For the prisoners sitting inside the American camps, these words created a painful contrast. Each day in the camp they received regular meals. They slept in clean barracks. Medical care was available whenever someone fell ill. The war that had destroyed their homeland felt very far away. The realization was difficult to ignore. While Germany was collapsing under the weight of war, they were living safely inside a country that seemed untouched by the destruction they had known. Some prisoners folded their letters slowly, staring at the wooden floor beneath their beds. Others shared the news quietly with friends sitting nearby, and as more letters arrived over the following weeks, the picture became clearer. The world they had left behind was no longer the same. For many of the prisoners, this created a deep and uncomfortable question. If the war had devastated Germany so completely, and if America was nothing like the enemy they had been warned about, then who had truly been telling the truth? The answer to that question would soon arrive in a moment that many of them would remember for the rest of their lives. The realization did not arrive all at once. There was no speech, no official announcement, no dramatic moment where someone stood in front of the prisoners and revealed the truth. Instead, it happened slowly, through dozens of small moments that began to connect together. A farmer thanking a prisoner for a hard day's work, a guard helping an injured soldier walk to the medical building, a warm meal placed on the table without hesitation, a letter from home describing hunger and destruction. Each of these moments alone might not have meant much, but together they began forming a picture that many of the prisoners could no longer ignore. One afternoon, a group of prisoners sat together outside their barracks after returning from farm work. The sun was low, and the camp was quiet except for the distant sounds of trucks moving along the road beyond the fences. The conversation turned again to the same subject that had been quietly growing inside the camp for months. America. One man spoke first. He had been a school teacher before the war, and the others often listened when he shared his thoughts. He said something simple. If the Americans are what we were told they were, why do they treat us like this? No one answered immediately, because the truth was becoming harder to deny. Everything they had experienced since their capture pointed in the same direction. The stories they had believed for years did not match the reality they were living in every day. Another soldier spoke quietly from across the bench. Maybe we were lied to. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one argued. No one laughed. Because deep down, many of them had already reached the same conclusion. The propaganda that had shaped their beliefs had not been completely honest. The enemy they had feared was not the monster they had been warned about. The realization was both shocking and unsettling. These men had fought a long and brutal war, believing they understood the world around them. They believed they knew who their enemies were and what those enemies stood for. Now that certainty was gone, and in its place was a new understanding that would follow them long after the war ended. Because once a person discovers that something they believed their entire life was not true, they begin to question many other things as well. And for thousands of German prisoners living inside American camps, that moment of questioning had finally arrived. When the war finally ended in 1945, the news reached the camps quietly. For many of the prisoners, the announcement created mixed emotions. The fighting was over. The long years of destruction and uncertainty had finally come to an end. Yet for the men inside the camps, a new question immediately appeared. What would happen to them now? Slowly, arrangements were made for prisoners to return to Europe. Groups were transported back across the Atlantic Ocean, the same journey they had taken months earlier. But this time, the feeling inside the ships was very different. Before, they had traveled toward a country they feared. Now they were leaving a place that had challenged everything they believed. When the ships approached the European coast, many prisoners stood on the decks looking at the land ahead of them. Germany was waiting. Their families, their towns, their old lives were somewhere beyond the horizon. But the country they returned to was not the one they had left. Cities were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had vanished under years of bombing. Factories that once powered the German economy stood silent or in ruins. Railways and bridges had been shattered by the war. Families struggled to rebuild their lives among the wreckage. For many former prisoners, the return home felt like stepping into a completely different world. The stability and order they had experienced inside the American camps stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that surrounded them now. Some men spoke quietly with their families about what they had seen in America. They described the camps, the food, the farms where they had worked, and the ordinary people who had treated them with a level of fairness they had never expected. At first, some listeners struggled to believe these stories. The propaganda that had shaped German society during the war had not disappeared overnight. Many people still carried the same beliefs about America and its soldiers. But the men who had lived through those camps spoke with certainty. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and the memories they carried would slowly spread through conversations in homes, towns, and communities across a country trying to understand what had happened to it. Yet the most important part of this story was not what happened after the war. It was the lesson that remained long after the prisoners had returned home. Years after the war ended, many of the former prisoners found themselves thinking back to those months they had spent inside the camps in the United States. At the time, they believed they had simply been waiting for the war to end. But with distance and reflection, many realized something deeper had happened during those quiet days behind barbed wire. They had witnessed something they had never expected to see in the middle of a global conflict: restraint, During a war that had devastated entire continents and cost millions of lives, they had encountered an enemy who chose to follow rules even when dealing with captured soldiers who had once fought against them. The Americans guarding those camps had the power to act with anger or revenge. After years of brutal fighting, no one would have been surprised if prisoners had been treated harshly. Yet the guards followed a different path. They enforced discipline, but they did not humiliate. They controlled the camps, but they did not abuse their authority. They treated their prisoners according to rules that recognized a simple idea, that even enemies remained human beings. For the German soldiers who experienced that treatment, the memory stayed with them long after they returned home. Some of them later spoke openly about what they had learned. Others shared the stories quietly with their children and grandchildren. The message was always similar. War can show the worst of humanity, but sometimes it also reveals the strength of those who refuse to abandon their principles. The camps where those prisoners lived during the war were not perfect places. They were still prisons surrounded by fences and guarded towers. Yet within those fences, thousands of men witnessed something that challenged everything they had believed. They discovered that the nation they had feared the most was not the enemy they had been taught to hate. And in that discovery, many of them carried away a lesson that would last for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the true character of a nation is not shown in how it defeats its enemies, but in how it chooses to treat them.